Good morning again to everyone, and a warm encouragement to come forward if you'd like in the room. You don't have to, but to fill in and make this a warmer, closer circle. So I'm really thrilled to be here, to be part of this gathering since yesterday, which has brought together a truly phenomenal, diverse and innovative group of activists and advocates, of organizers, lawyers, and scholars to have what I think have been and will continue to be with this panel and today some really transformative conversations about data as a tool and a weapon, an amplifier and a silencer, and unquestionably as a terrain of political contestation. We've heard a lot since yesterday. Forgive me, I should probably introduce myself first before I go into framing this panel. My name is Nikki Reich, and I work here at NYU School of Law at the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice and with the Global Justice Clinic as a human rights lawyer. So thank you again to the organizers and for the invitation to take part and to be part of the audience for this really phenomenal panel. We've heard a lot since yesterday about how data, the way that we name, categorize, and label things, and the information that we use to make sense of and interpret our experience of the world around us, can and do distort, do violence, and even incarcerate us. But we've also heard about how data recognize and reveal, validate, and potentially liberate. And I would argue, as we'll discuss more today, how data can help create and bring into existence new realities. In addition to describing the world around us, data can actually, hopefully, help create the world that we want to live in. And so redefining data and shaping our data stories and our data bodies, to borrow language from some of our panelists, really holds hope and promise for the future. Crucially, we've been reminded repeatedly that data are about people, not numbers or spreadsheets, and that democratizing data creation and consumption and harnessing data to advance rather than threaten human rights requires demystification, deconstruction, and crucially centering affected communities. It's clear that democratizing data can't be reduced to just disseminating a spreadsheet. It requires really a fundamental reconceptualization of what data encompasses, what data are and can be, and a decentering of overly technocratic definitions and limited expert authority over what constitutes credible and valuable data. In some ways, this panel returns us to the fundamental question of what constitutes data. How expansive is our definition of data? How does it help to think about various processes of information gathering, storytelling, memory formation, and advocacy as data creation, manipulation, communication, or analysis? If, as Hamid said a moment ago earlier this morning, organizing is sharing and building collective stories and histories, then in many ways this panel is a panel of organizers who are involved in creatively building and sharing stories. So the terrific panelists from whom you'll hear in a moment are each in their own way pushing the boundaries of what constitutes data, of how data is created, conveyed, and used. They'll share their perspectives and creative strategies and tactics with community-led initiatives defining data as art and as evidence essential for healing, inclusion, and liberation. Full bios for each of the speakers are in the programs, which you have in paper and online, but I'll just give you a preview who you'll hear from before introducing the speakers. So first we'll hear from Anusha Chandrasekaran, who is a senior program manager at Praxis, which is a development support organization in India that's committed to mainstreaming the voices of the poor and marginalized sections of society in the quest for equity and governance. And she's led Praxis's ground-level panels, about which we'll hear more in a moment, a project that aims to democratize global policymaking and processes through participatory research and digital storytelling. To her left is Katie Diamond, the communications director of the Theater of the Oppressed in NYC, an organization that partners with communities facing discrimination to inspire transformative action through theater. And Diamond has been an artist, organizer, and activist for over a decade, using both visual art and theater as tools for social change. To her left is Nitin Sahani, who is the assistant professor of media studies at the New School and a faculty fellow with the Graduate Institute for Design, Ethnography, and Social Thought. His work focuses on creative urban tactics, participatory research, performance, and documentary film. And he has conducted digital storytelling initiatives, documentary film, and participatory media programs around the world in places as diverse as Palestine and Guatemala, and other places we'll hear about soon. LaTonya Tate is a 2018 Soros Justice Fellow, in good company in this room, I think, and the founder and executive director of the Alabama Justice Initiative based in Birmingham, Alabama. Her fellowship is dedicated to integrating effective community-based practices, including participatory defense, into Alabama's probation and parole practices. So much like the other panels, we'll have initial remarks from each of the panelists, and then we'll try to have a bit of a moderated conversation between and among the panelists to respond to each other and a few questions to really unpack this notion of data and its creative potential and frontiers, and then really hopefully have time for all of you before we move into the lunch hour to ask questions and engage in a discussion. So with that, let me turn it over to Anisha. Thank you. And we're going to have some slides, and it wouldn't be a creative panel if we didn't have some images and creative sounds and pictures, so forgive us for the technical interludes.
That's not an issue. So hi, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I'd like to start I'll be talking today about two pieces of the work that Praxis does. One, as Nikki mentioned, is the ground level panels, and the other one is digital storytelling. So I'll just start with what the ground level panels are. So sometime in 2012, 2013, when the United Nations was wondering what to do after the Millennium Development Goals framework, they set up the United Nations High-Level Panel of Experts that was meant to come up with an alternate development framework. So there was a lot of conversation across the world about which was thinking about whether this panel was also, like the MDG panel, going to be a top-down panel of experts, which are going to be sitting in an AC room and thinking about what global policies should look like. And thankfully, there were many players across the world who came and said, this is not the way the new framework should be. And there was a lot of bottom-up participatory initiatives which ensured that community voices should decide what should go into any development framework that comes forward. So one such initiative was the ground level panels. So the ground level panels, as the name suggests, is basically, it's basically a contrast to the high level panels. And the idea that the ground level panels talks about is the panel is a panel of experts. And these are people who are experts of their own lived experiences of marginalization, vulnerability, and exclusion. So this vulnerability and exclusion is in many forms. It can be because of gender, race, religion, caste, ability, exposure to climate change, disaster, and many such things. So what Praxis did was in India, we brought together a group of 15 people from across the country. And yes, of course, India is a big country and 15 people are hardly representative. But the idea was to have people who have faced experiences of exclusion to come and talk about what their experience has been. And over a period of 4 days, this panel basically brought together some of the data that they faced in their communities, the kind of stigma and exclusion that they faced. And they talked about the MDG, and in a panel of 15 people, there was just one person who had ever heard about Millennium Development Goals. The others had to be taken through what the goals were and what a global development framework itself is. And this panel then came up with certain recommendations for the high-level panel. And like many other processes, shared these with the high-level panel in many ways. So I'm going to be talking today about one specific, so this ground level panel was something that we then followed over the next 5 to 6 years with different groups. For example, we did one on education where we brought together students from different experiences like dropout children, children who had never been to school, children who, because of their disability, had trouble getting access to proper education, children who had faced discrimination and hence dropped out. So there was a variety of panels like the one on children. So today I'm going to be talking very specifically about a group of nomadic and denotified tribes. So I'll just play a small digital, it's just the beginning of the digital story. The full thing is available online. But you can just see, rather than me telling you about who the nomadic tribes are, so I'll just let the digital story do that.
हमें चाहिए आजाद समुदाय बाय जयेंद्र एंड अनिश। ये कहानी एक ऐसे समुदाय की है या ऐसे समुदायों की है जो भारत के नक्शे में या शहर में होते हुए भी उनका हिस्सा न बन पाए। इन समुदायों को राजा महाराजाओं के समय से ही अपनी जंग के लिए इस्तेमाल किया जाता था। ऐसे ही समुदायों में से एक समुदाय है छारा समुदाय। छारा समुदाय को राजा महाराजाओं के समय से ही जंग के लिए इस्तेमाल किया गया और फिर उस समुदाय को अपने ही हाल पर छोड़ दिया जाता। राजा महाराजाओं के बाद अंग्रेज हुकूमत आई। सन 1857 में ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी के खिलाफ लड़ने के लिए इसी छारा समुदाय और आदिवासी जातियों को आगे किया गया। उसके बाद अंग्रेज हुकूमत के साथ सभी राजा महाराजाओं ने समझौता कर लिया, लेकिन छारा समुदाय और आदिवासी जातियों ने अपनी जंग जारी रखी थी और इसी के चलते छारा समुदाय जैसी जातियों को पकड़ने के लिए अंग्रेजी हुकूमत ने क्रिमिनल कास्ट एंड ट्राइब एक्ट ऑफ 1871 जारी किया। इसी के तहत छारा समुदाय और आदिवासी जातियों को एक सेटलमेंट में रखा जाता था। सेटलमेंट में बंधुआ मजदूरों की तरह रखा जाता था, जिनमें उनसे कम मजदूरी में काम करवाना, जैसे कि सड़क का निर्माण करना, कारखाने में काम करवाना और अंग्रेजों के मनोरंजन के लिए शराब बनाना।
Right. So, like yesterday, even Peter was talking about how an archaic British law was used to criminalize the MSM and homosexual community. So similarly, we have another archaic British law that criminalized certain tribes. Of course, after India got independence, this act itself was denotified. So these tribes were no longer considered criminal, but this act was replaced by something called the Habitual Offenders Act. So in a sense, while legally they were no longer criminals, the social response to them was they were always treated as criminals, and in a sense, they live on the fringes of illegality and immorality because of their occupation, because of who they are, in what communities they were born into. So when we are talking about a ground level panel, so the ground level panel uses certain tools like the digital stories and stakeholder analysis, some kind of intergenerational mapping to look at what these experiences of the panel members have been. So I'll just show you an example of an intergenerational map. Like this map is basically analyzing how laws ended up criminalizing certain occupations. This is the story of one person who belongs to a Kuchband community. It's basically a tribe in northern India. And while the person, his grandfather's generation used to make traditional medicines using deer horn and various kinds of herbs. Now, gradually with allopathic medicines coming into the market and also with changes to wildlife protection laws, what happened is their traditional medicine came to be questioned. And eventually the communities these days, they end up picking rags, begging, or doing daily wage labor. So there are several communities like this which are outlawed because of what work they do. Now, at the ground level panel, the participants collectively analyzed what is the reason for their situation. And then they came up with demands for the government of India. And here they spoke about the basic rights of education, livelihood. And they said that these are rights that are already enshrined in the Indian Constitution. But there are certain barriers, and they wanted the government to look at these barriers, to break down these barriers, and to see why these basic rights are not being accessible to some communities. So the ground level panel, as well as the digital stories, what they help question the dominant narratives that are there of stigmatization, and they create an alternate narrative that these communities can be proud of. So I'll just give you one example of a way in which the digital stories were used by these communities. Recently, I mean, just a couple of, like 6 months ago, some people from the Chara community, which had made the digital story you just saw, some youth were picked up by the police on false charges of rioting, and they were put into the police station without any kind of cases against them. So the youth of the community used some of these digital stories that they had created to build a narrative and to talk about police violence that they had faced over the years. And this, in a sense, also made people aware that there are communities that are so stigmatized, because otherwise the response is that this is not our reality. It's a reality of another group that we don't know about and we choose not to know about. So what I have also heard over the last 2 days, like yesterday and today, is basically that what it's also very integral to the work that Praxis does is that communities are not merely, like, it's not merely respondents or beneficiaries, and it is important that they move to the space of being active researchers who generate, use, monitor, and own their own data. Because they understand the key indicators that define any kind of change, because they live those indicators. And they know how mere numbers do not necessarily reflect the subjective realities, because they have faced the result of being reduced to just numbers. What is required, therefore, is that communities like the denotified and nomadic tribes should be at the center of any kind of data generation and sustain reflection-based action. Also, at this point, I'd like to add that communities are not necessarily monoliths. Within every community, there are some who are more marginalized than the other, and any effort to bring community voices to the fore must take into account that these voices exist and ensure that the more marginalized among the excluded are given a space at the decision-making table. Do I have time? Oh, yeah, thanks. So, while we're talking about conventional research, it basically brings human beings and transforms their experiences into data points. What participatory research, what many of you in the room have been doing, is to once again give human beings that dignity and make them beyond just data points, make them into, in sometimes co-researchers, and make their experience beyond just a spreadsheet. And what ground level panels tries to do is to convert their lived experience into their expertise, so that they can use it in a way that they talk about their realities on a panel rather than having other people talk on their behalf. However, just to raise a few points, some introspection and some thoughts that have been going on in my mind over the last 2 days, it's basically, while we say that participatory methods might actually be providing it's like a panacea to all the illnesses of conventional research, but there are certain questions within participatory research also. It tries to break down the hierarchy between the researcher and the researched, making the researched person also part of the analysis. But then the question that I'm grappling with is sometimes there is a lot of rigidity in research methodologies, which works against the people who are, which works against the communities. And also there is a lot of hierarchy between the research design that might be there and the research itself. What is the space to question and challenge these research design that a community member has? And also in a lot of work that we have been hearing about, what is the space that a community has in once they have given their consent, and over time, if they do not want to be part of the research process, is there a space that the research offers for them to move back, step back and move out of this process itself? And for me, rather than having any kind of answers to this, a platform like this, a conference like this, gives the space to raise some of these questions, to think about them, and probably to revisit them in our work going forward. So that's where I'd like to end. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we're going to do a little dance of switching back seats, but I'm going to turn the mic over to Katie Diamond.
Hello, I'm actually going to do something that, like, hello, it's the middle of the morning, you've had your breakfast, and it's Theater of the Oppressed, so why would you be in your seats? I'm going to start us off with a theater game before I explain anything about what we're about, so you all can sort of experience that. So if there's stuff in your lap, you're not going to make you stand, but if there's stuff in your lap or you're holding onto something or you have a coffee, like, set it aside for a split second so you don't, like, knock everything over and then it's a dramatic theater game. We're all about disrupting and demechanizing people's minds at Theater of the Oppressed, so I'm gonna open up your minds a little bit more than they're already like really cracked open, so like prepare yourselves. We're gonna play a game called Opposite of Jackson. When I say no, what's the opposite of no?
Yes.
Great, so when I say no, you say yes. No?
Yes.
No.
Yes.
No, no, no.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yes, no, yes.
Yes, no.
Okay, all right, do you see what I'm trying to do here? Okay, all right. Let's do that one more time. No, yes, no.
Yes, no, yes.
Okay, all right. So when I say up, you say down, right? Down. Up.
Down.
Everyone's very excited, I like it. When I say up,
Down.
down, down, down.
Up, up, up.
Up, down, up.
Down, up, down.
Yes, no, up.
No, yes, no. Down.
Great. All right. So we're gonna move our bodies a little bit with this one. All right. So your brains are getting there, and now let's move your bodies. So when I say head, touch your shoulders. I'm just modifying it for the sake of everyone staying sitting. So when I say head, touch your shoulders. When I say shoulders, touch your head. Head, shoulders. Head, shoulders. Great. No, up, down.
Yes. No. Down.
No, yes, head.
Yes.
Give yourselves a round of applause. That was great. Great. So one of the foundations of Theater of the Oppressed and the way we practice it here at Theater of the Oppressed NYC is the notion of demechanization, as I mentioned. So the whole idea is that you need to experience the world in your body. We're doing a lot of talking here, which is why I wanted us to sort of like play this game. So Theater of the Oppressed as a foundation was started by this gentleman, Augusto Boal. He's this Brazilian gentleman. He was friends with Paulo Freire, who wrote Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Highly recommend Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It's very dense. Take your time. Augusto Boal took standard theater games and then laid them over the notion of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which my tiny elevator pitch about what Pedagogy of the Oppressed is that you just don't tell people what their experiences are. They need to move through the world and learn those things on their own, and learn about oppression and learn about injustice in their own bodies in their own way. And so Augusto took those notions and then took theater games and made it so you experience and learn what injustice is and what oppression is and what's going on in your own communities using the nature of theater and slowly ramping up the theater games to make it so eventually we're having these really complex conversations about not just interpersonal racism, but also institutional racism and systemic racism, and so on and so forth. So the way we practice it at Theater of the Oppressed NYC is we actually partner with social service organizations throughout the city, and we form theater troupes, and those theater troupes rehearse for about 8 to 12 weeks, and it culminates in a show. And this isn't just any show that you get up and everyone's performing their oppression for people and then everyone claps and leaves. It's not this sort of awkward minstrel act. What we do is, it's called forum theater, because a forum is a place where public ideas are exchanged. And forum theater is, the show goes, you watch this show, and then the facilitators, who we call jokers, because jokers are meant to problematize the situation, our jokers will ask the audience to turn to each other and talk about any problems that they saw in the show, and what solutions might we generate, having witnessed the various injustices going on in the world. And after that brainstorm happens, sort of one-on-one among audience members, the jokers ask an audience member to come up and take on the role of the protagonist in the show and actually try to change the outcome of the show. So they get to try out their idea. And so this is what we call rehearsing for the revolution. You get to actually try to, walk in the shoes is a gross way to put it, but it's the shortest version I have. But you basically try to figure out what are the systems here and how can I try to change them. So that's how forum theater works, and that's how we do forum theater at Theater of the Oppressed NYC. There's this other layer that we've been working really hard on for the last 6 years, which we call the umbrella of creative advocacy. We're trying to connect not just what you see on stage and then you try something out and then you get to leave and you feel good, though there's nothing entirely wrong with that. We want to also force people to really think about how these systems are all connected. And so I guess I'll try pressing this button.
Left and right.
Okay. So that's just one of our troops high-fiving, which is super fun. So Augusto Boal went on to become a legislator in Brazil. And what he did is he actually took Forum Theater and he decided that the way I'm going to get my other legislators to understand what oppression is in Brazil is I'm going to have people with the lived experiences of what's going on in their communities perform Forum Theater in the chambers. So, and he called it legislative theater, just in case anybody needed something that wasn't entirely clear about what it was. So we do something called legislative theater under the umbrella of what we call creative advocacy. We do forum theater, what I've just described, and we invite legislators and activists and organizers and policymakers and people also directly affected by the issues in the shows into the audience, and then also they generate policy ideas at the end of each show. They generate policy ideas, and those legislators then commit to figuring out how they're actually going to move the needle on those policy ideas. And so what you see here is everyone's policy ideas being furiously engaged with at one of our shows. We've sort of like, just because it's data, so I'll talk about it. We recently moved digital, which was cool, where people could actually type in and on a platform and then have it show up on a screen, and that was just really cool, but it doesn't make for very good photos. And this is everyone voting on those panels. This past round, we voted digitally, which again, looked great on the screen in real time to watch these like amazing graphs go do 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 do, but like that's photos really boring. But we used to actually have it so you actually, when you came to one of our shows, you got a piece of paper that was green on one side and red on the other, and basically if you didn't like that policy idea, you were like, no, yes. And so in the room, we were gathering real data in the room about people's experiences and watching basically the scaffolded notion of these were people affected by the issue, here's their experience with the issue, and then here are their actual ideas about how to make change from a systemic level on that issue, and then make those legislators commit to having something to do, make that change. And so I have, if you really like to be nerdy, I actually have, we released a report last year about all of the various things we've changed in New York City using this model. So find me, you can have a hard copy, it's also available online. And to wrap up, I guess I had to think about this. Like, I'm someone who believes that stories, which is a reoccurring theme in the last 2 days, that stories are like the real way to make change in the world. And not like on an interpersonal level, like I don't need us all to, again, feel like warm and fuzzy. I want us to think about real policy when we think about stories. And so I really had to think to myself, like, well, how is this data? Because for me, we're making change and we're gathering the information about that change, but like, how is it data? And all I could think was, so these stories are a means to make change in the world, and it's actual, everyone yesterday was also talking about like the notion of like quantifying like experiences, which data, when it's flattened, kind of like flattens the notion of what that means. But this is a quantifiable evidence of injustice, and then we brainstorm solutions in real time with people that are directly affected by these issues. And I think that is evidence that's also adaptable, evidence that's also based in lived experiences and in humanizes data. So I think that if I was to take us to the next level of like where is Theater of the Oppressed NYC going with how we really connect to policy, I think it's humanizing data is something that I would say. So thank you, and thanks for playing with me.
I knew this panel was going to be creative and get everyone moving, so this is great. Let's turn it over to Nathan. And I'm going to move also. Embodied data.
Okay, I'm glad I went after Katie because she's managed to raise the energy in the room. And I might not do that. Might not do it very well. Okay, so I teach at the New School in a media studies program. My background's actually computer science and documentary film. And what I teach my students often is how to think about contested spaces, places of conflict, both locally and internationally, and how to do that through participatory action research, how to do that through sensory ethnography. Often the kinds of questions I'm asking and my students are asking are not questions that have easy answers. Sometimes they have no answers. They're often dealing with places that have a lot of ambiguity and also dealing with timescales. We talked about time yesterday, that can be very, very long. Timescales where there's been some sort of repression, there's been silence around an issue, and a typical human rights-oriented, legalistic tactic may not work in really unpacking those issues. So how do we address these fissures, these invisible injustices? How do we do them through sensitivity, through care, through integrity, and how do we do them through an artistic sensibility? And so I find myself working in places like Gaza and Guatemala, where there is an untenable conflict. There are decades of violence and injustice that are occurring and are continuing to occur. The intergenerational traumas. And as an outsider in most of these places, what do I do? How do I unpack these issues with people on the ground? So I see myself not as an artist. I don't see myself as someone who's trying to do a human rights kind of legal intervention in these places. I see myself as facilitating dialogue, as providing opportunities for producing sensory and aesthetic windows into these issues. So I'll show you very briefly a piece from a documentary that I've been working on, and it might help you unpack a couple of things. It has to do with a site in Guatemala that's been fairly contested. Guatemala went through over several decades of civil war and what many people call a genocide, where over 200,000 indigenous communities and civilians were killed along the way. And while the conflict has been discussed a great deal in the human rights realm and through the court systems, it's harder to talk about silences and injustices that are in certain sites of memory that are not being discussed. And how do you go about doing that?
En algún momento sentí como que un aire pasó por mis pies y era algo muy extraño, pero no lo pensé mucho, solo era como, ¿qué fue eso? Y luego me quedé pensando en lo fuerte que es estar acá, o sea, en esto tan simple que estamos haciendo, pero que yo siento que las energías que están aquí en este lugar me las estoy como apropiando, o sea, me siento más fuerte, digamos, de lo que cuando vine. Algunas personas le llaman la antigua estación, otras personas le llaman la zona militar.
La idea de zona intervenida consistía en mostrar el potencial del centro intercultural, aprovechando para la producción artística y cultural de la ciudad, de cierta manera también reclamar el espacio para su utilización en comunidad para actividades de encuentro y reflexión. Esto implicaba, por supuesto, la exploración y revisión tanto del espacio como de la historia. Así van surgiendo las reuniones de trabajo, las investigaciones, los talleres y así los primeros experimentos artísticos. Nosotros les llamamos intervenciones. Abrimos una invitación pública en prensa, en medios, para que más personas se unieran voluntariamente a esta iniciativa.
Aquí directamente ya salía como ministro de la Defensa, porque esta era una zona muy importante, más importante que el cuartel general, o que Mariscal Zavala, o que la Guardia de Honor en la capital. Más que todo era como una escuela donde venían a aprender los militares, como, ¿cómo se llama?, ejercer su carrera militar. Entonces, por lo mismo, era muy influyente y aquí pasaron muchas cosas que tienen que ver con lo que hasta hoy es la democracia en Guatemala. Había un dicho militar que mucho tiempo nosotros lo usábamos, pues, porque nos decía que lo que nosotros mirábamos y lo que nosotros vivíamos aquí, pero ni nuestra misma esposa debía de saber. Aquí mataron en este lugar, podría decirle yo, la cantidad no se la puedo decir, pero cientos tal vez de personas que murieron en este lugar.
Ahora que lo pienso, Padre, somos las rajaduras en los vidrios, el nido de las palomas en el techo, los pisos manchados, el eco de los cuartos vacíos, el polvo acumulado, la bandera izada a las 6 de la tarde, los 21 cañonazos. Hay tantas cosas que quedan marcadas como tatuajes que honran nuestra memoria. Padre, en este sitio todo es silencio. El tiempo ha dejado su huella, como la misma sensación que produce despertar brutalmente de un sueño. Qué difícil sería, Padre, pasar la noche en vela, esperando aquellas cosas que uno siempre espera que no pasen.
So, I'm just going to bring a closure to this piece. It's an hour-long film, and what I've been doing for over 3.5 years, going back and forth to Guatemala, is working with a number of these artists, dancers, poets, writers, to talk about these repressed spaces of memory. The site, as you could tell, was a former train station that the Guatemalan military took over and converted into the base of operations for the guerrilla warfare against the guerrillas in the highlands of Guatemala. And when the peace accords were signed in the late 90s, the space was given back to the city, but was then used by the military class and the kind of business class to kind of repurpose it for their own needs rather than a space to honor the thousands of people who must have died there. So all of these people who I met over the years, we worked kind of undercover in this space to do these performances and a series of interventions that I filmed. And months later, we were able to speak to the city about this issue and invite people to come and see these things and begin to open up the dialogue, because people are afraid to talk about what happened here. I've asked human rights investigators about this place, and even they don't have evidence and data to show of what happened here. So we talked to archivists, we talked to writers, poets, and we said, how can you talk about these issues in a way that maybe can't be spoken in human rights documents? Two of the participants in the film were actually children of people involved in the site. One was the son of a soldier, and the other was the son of a car mechanic who then disavowed being there, knowing what had happened there. So Marvin read a poem, as you saw, speaking to his father about what happened. So to me, this form of poetry and performance and embodied memory is another way of thinking about data and bringing evidence and engaging in a site of memory. Over the years, and I'll just quickly switch gears, I've been continuing to work in Guatemala with collectives of artists all across Guatemala, in indigenous communities, in places where these kind of atrocities were committed, to find ways to have them collaborate with us. We've done a series of workshops for over 2.5 years where we would have artists work with an astrophysicist, an artist work with an anthropologist, and bring different perspectives through science, arts, and humanities to works that can have a more compelling way of talking about what happened. This book, A Burnt Book, represents a project that happened in Patricia, a small village in Guatemala, where people would willingly burn their own books because those books represented Marxist communist ideology, which the military would use subject people and imprison them. So they would burn their own books to remove evidence of their involvement in these things. This was an experimental piece by a young Guatemalan artist. She took the words of an American who had been to Guatemala in the 70s and 80s when the war was going on and written testimony about what happened. She took those words and converted them to the Mayan indigenous language and imprinted them onto a stone as a way to represent testimony. So each of these projects, and I'll show one quick one, which was, I think, also very, very powerful. We asked forensic scientists who were digging up exhumations of people who had been killed to work with a sound artist. And so we came up with this, I collaborated with them to come up with this way of uncovering cases so you would open the drawer and read about each person who had died and why they died and their stories and so on. As you're doing that, you're listening to a soundtrack of a composition that also spoke to that a sound artist created. It was haunting. So sometimes it's very hard to talk about these things in a human rights document through legal evidence. You have to find a different compelling way. For me, the process is just as crucial. The 3.5 years we spent with these groups, conducting the inquiry, conducting the embodied performance, more so than just what came out at the very end. So that's the kind of thing we've done. And one last one I'll show you is where we engaged children in the process. We built a kind of timeline of what happened in Guatemala, both politically and artistically. And we had that timeline displayed in 3 different exhibitions, both in New York and in Guatemala. And we had children write memories and write fictional and real accounts and put those memories on top of the timeline. And then we recorded those memories into a digital database and tried to have it live beyond. So I think it requires sometimes an artistic approach to talk about things that have a very different timescale and invisible injustice. So I'll leave it there.
On to you, Tanya. This is gonna be a fantastic discussion at the end. I can see already. So,
Good morning, evening. I'm under the weather, but greetings. I am LaTanya Tate. I just want to thank Suki and everybody for inviting me here, and my Soros Justice fellow Jody Polk, who I work real closely with our work. Again, I am LaTanya Tate, and what brings me on this side of the gate is in 2001, my son was arrested in Birmingham, Alabama, and was charged with robbery 1, which is armed robbery, which carries 20 years to life in prison. So he was given the low end of the sentence, which was 20 years. My career during that phase, I was in the medical field, had been in the medical field since the 90s. And prior to my son being arrested, I was one of these people that lived in the community. I came from a middle-class family, uncles, aunts, first graduate in my family to graduate college. My cousins were like football, track stars, and they began, to get jobs, and they were given college scholarships, but they didn't finish college, so I was the first college grad to graduate and my grandparents were living at that time. My mom, was a postal worker, so I watched people that I grew up with cycle in and out of jail and went to prison at young ages, and out of sight, out of mind. It wasn't me, didn't care, so I'm like, okay. But when things begin to change and hit your front door, you get a whole different perspective, of what is transpiring. I didn't know a whole lot about the criminal justice system until my son got arrested, and then I began to learn about what felony convictions was, and took a whole different mindset about, wow, what is happening here. My son had never been in any trouble. He was didn't have no type of juvenile history or anything, and he ended up going to adult prison. So my career shifted. I ended up getting my degree in criminal justice, and then when I graduated from University of Phoenix, I got offered a job with the state of Florida, and I walked into a probation and parole officer job where I worked a job for nearly a decade. I worked in a rural county. If many people are familiar with Destin, Florida, that county is called Walton County, where a lot of people travel to the beach. I worked in a little small town called Defuniak Springs, Florida, and during that time, my son was incarcerated. So my whole mindset was I was the only African-American female in my office, and the right town was like maybe 95% Caucasian people. So doing the job, my mindset was, I had a lot of power doing this job. I began to see the racial disparities, seeing people that had committed crimes like my son, being placed on probation, because Florida does not have parole, they abolish parole. And with all of this power, I could have reverted my anger into, just being very just what I call just very hardcore, which I was hardcore because you had to be hardcore, you had to establish yourself. But I also was thinking about every decision I made it based upon my son sitting in Alabama prison. So I always, like I said, being the only Caucasian black female in my office, my counterparts were used to putting people in jail because that's what they did. So if you tested positive for drugs and you were going to jail, if you violated any condition of your supervision, you were going to jail. So I, began to kind of start shifting the paradigm in my office and saying, why are we, jailing people for substance abuse issues or just maybe missing a curfew or missing a visit or whatever. So why are we, doing these practices? So what I learned in doing the job is Florida has 67 counties, and each county is divided into circuits, and the judge had a judicial preference where if somebody tested positive for drugs, you could send a technical letter, to the courts, or, you supervising people that are low poverty, people that don't have jobs, people just trying to make means every day. So how do we suspend the money and put them back in the very communities that they destroy? So that's what I began to start doing, and my colleagues was looking at me like, are you kidding me? No, I'm not kidding you, because it's a culture thing. When you come into any type of law enforcement job, people want you to adapt to this culture, this brotherhood, this sisterhood. But learning the job and doing the job for nearly a decade taught me so much. The very people that we were jailing, I began to start teaching GED classes in the jail, our local jail. I became the prison liaison. So I really became like what we call this resource officer, in my office. And all during this time, my son's still sitting, in an Alabama prison, but my colleagues had no idea why I was focusing on more of reentry and restorative practices, and that in the position that I was going. So I ended up retiring in 2014. Took a little break from it all, just to come down from it all. My son ended up getting violated for violating one of his parole conditions, as technical violations, as we call it, and he ended up going back to prison for 3 years. And that did not sit well with me. So I, like I said, I was on this little hiatus, took a little break, but I still had to be his advocate in all of this. So when, in 2017, I saw the opportunity for the fellowship. So I applied for the fellowship and, was phased through the fellowship, but made it to New York and was chosen as one of the 16. And that spoke volumes because it had not been a thorough justice fellow in Alabama since 2005. So when I began to go back and just start analyzing my project, probation and parole practices in Alabama with an emphasis, to still keep up with what is going on in Florida, I began to see how storytelling is very, very powerful. I began to see how data is very, very powerful because I began to start getting these reports from like the Pew Trust Foundation, the prison policy, the prison sentencing, just to see all the data that had been collected about probation and parole. Because what you're seeing happening now is you have twice as many people that are on probation and parole than there are sitting in prisons. So when looking at all the data and all the reports that I had been given, I began to see how many people were being sent back into prison when it came to technical violations. And that number is very, very large. And we talk about mass incarceration. So how do we shift these things and try to get the community engaged? And that looks like getting families that have been silenced and people that this is affecting to elevate your voice and become powerful. Because I look at it as like if we vote. When we vote in silence and we send a message. So if you raise your voice, that's your power, and you send a message to the very people that are making, these laws. So I interject that in probation and parole. I was introduced to participatory defense. And what we did with participatory defense is we used that model, and that's just like driving, the community, those that have been charged with crimes, to get involved in their case, get the community engaged, and lift up your power, because it shifts the whole courtroom. It can shift the whole trajectory in the courtroom, and that's what people don't realize. And what people don't realize is when you go to court and the person is being charged with a crime, the DA has painted a picture, of this person. So what we use the participatory defense model for is we build social bios out there. And what that looks like is the DA and the judge only knows what the DA has told them about this individual. So how we shift that mindset is we build a social bio by giving the judge, like, this is who this person is. We build that person's character up. We start out by collecting pictures. We start out if that person was in college, school, jobs, getting the community engaged, filling up the courtroom with the community, knowing that this person has support. This is not this menace or this individual that the DA is trying to paint of as a bad person. So the participatory defense, the data sharing, and all that is a good model to use. I've been successful with my project. I've won 3 parole hearings. We shaved off time on a young man. He had got sentenced to a 3-year prison sentence for armed robbery. He was in prison for 5 months. I successfully won the parole hearing in December of last year. So if you take the 5 months that he served and take off the 3 years, so you shaved off a lot of time using the participatory defense social bio model. We also did a guy that was charged with felony murder, had been in prison for 19 years, went up for parole maybe 3 additional times prior to us taking on the participatory model with the parole board. Of course, the Attorney General was there protesting, but we were successful. We won that case as well. I won another parole hearing on February the 28th. A young man was in for drug charges, so we shaved off about 2 years off of his time in prison, so he's to exit the prison on Tuesday. So the data sharing and the storytelling, bringing all that in, to probation and parole, and trying to get the community engaged. Because what I'm learning in the South is the people have been oppressed for so long, and they think their voices are not powerful, where they're not using them and elevating them to be heard. So my thing is, with my project in Alabama Justice Initiative, which is the organization that I founded, it was birthed out of my fellowship. And the goal of this organization is to drive advocacy and do policy work and elevate the voices and the stories of these things that are the barriers that people are facing in the community. So when I look at probation and parole, and being a former officer myself, I don't just only look at those that are on probation and parole. I look at my project is also assisting and helping the officers, because I've been one of them. I know what it's like to carry a caseload of 200 people. There's no way that you can effectively supervise that many people. Somebody's gonna get, a whole lot of people are gonna get lost in the crunch. So when you run the numbers, and what people don't realize is you may be supervising 200 people actively, but we also have to keep up with those that have absconded supervision where we don't know where they are. They may be in New York doing some things, and we have to keep up with that. You know, we call those absconders. You have to keep up with the people that you have in jail, the people that you have in prison. So when you do run your numbers and crunch your numbers, you got like a caseload of 500 people. So what you find in these situations is stressful officers. So if we had, like in Alabama, it's no policy to drive people off parole. You know, we have this policy to put graduate sanctions on individuals that commit technical violations. So what we're driving in the community, and we're getting people together and organizing to use your power, use your voice, the lawmakers, the people that are, and I like what my panelists say, how can you make decisions and people are not at the table that these things are affecting? So that's the mindset. You know, it's a challenge in Alabama because the people have been so, you know, voiceless for so long, and they have just been oppressed for so long, where they don't think that my voice or, you know, what I'm going through does not matter. Yes, it does matter. We have the power to shift change. You know, where I live at, all around the country, we have the power to shift change with storytelling, you know, coming to the table and demanding a seat at the table. You know, because you cannot continue to make these blanket laws and we're not a part of this conversation. So how are you arriving to the decisions, you know, that you're making? You know, are you making the decisions based off of some crimes that maybe people on parole have committed, and you're making these blanket laws based off of one person's mistake? So we can't keep punishing and criminalizing individuals and keep this driver around people's neck, you know, with these long, extended periods of supervision. That's failure all within itself. You're setting the people up to fail. You know, you have no outlet. So what I'm doing in Alabama, and what I would like to see happen around the country, is for states to start looking at parole reform. A lot of states are looking at parole reform. New York is proposing what they call a Less is More Act. California has a bill, Assembly Bill 277, which that looks like giving those that are on supervision credits. Like if they do good for 30 days, you give them 30 days of credit. So you graduating them off of these long periods of supervision, which I call them tripwires, because that's what they are. You releasing people out of prison, you still punishing them, you still penalizing them beyond the prison sentence that they've served. So that's what it looks like: data sharing, data collecting, and all of this. When it comes down to it, the data sharing and the collection is going to be used to drive policy and drive change.
Wow. So there's a lot on this growing table here that these amazing panelists have put forward. And I think in the spirit of slowing things down, as we did yesterday, just want to take a moment to absorb and marinate in the very different experiences that were put on the table here, and for all of us to think through. And I really invite you in the audience to think through this question about how these approaches to embodied data, to engagement and participation with lived experience and storytelling relate to the theme of this conference and what brings us all together. And I think there are lots of different connections we can make, and so I encourage you, as you're reflecting, to think about some of those and where your questions lie. I want to put a question or two to the panel, or an observation or two, and then really invite you all to have a moment to react to each other's presentations and what you've shared, and to disco a little bit if we want to. We'll do discotheque. But really to reflect on how these very different approaches and contexts of working can enrich one another. One thing, just to kick off some of that reflection and get the juices flowing about it, I mean, something that I think is a thread throughout all of the experiences is really this emphasis on engagement, active, embodied participation in both responding to data and creating data, and also really grappling with filling gaps and questioning whether those gaps in what is recorded, collected, and presented as a representation of the world and lived experience, whether there are new and innovative ways to fill those gaps, to address who is left out of the picture that's painted, and really actually to fundamentally question whether there are certain kinds of experiences, realities, memories that can't be put into something that we would call data, that data and this process of datification actually can't capture. And I think something that Nitin said about art and engaging artists in a number of different interdisciplinary conversations and spaces can actually help to bring to light and to create memories that won't otherwise be seen and heard. And that there may well be, and I challenge us all to think about whether there are certain questions and ambiguities about the way that we live amongst each other and oppress or uplift one another that can't actually be addressed through data, that have to be experienced in a sensory way, but also to challenge ourselves to think about blowing open our notion of what data is, what the inputs are that inform the way that we work and we think about changing our reality through policy change or otherwise, that sensory experience and embodied experience is a fundamental input that we as infants, those are the data points that we use to develop our understanding of the world, whether it's by eating everything that a little baby finds on the ground and deciding what that means. But I think more generally, what imprint an experience has emotionally and sensorially on us really informs our level of comfort in that space, whether we feel empowered in that space or we feel restrained and constrained in that space, and what can happen there. And so I think it's really important for us to think through in the ways that we work, how the form of our work and the spaces in which we're acting and the actually shapes the outcomes and the efficacy of our change work. So just a smattering of thoughts that I think came through in what were really rich and very varied and diverse experiences. So I guess a couple questions to you all, and you can take either or neither of them in responding and thinking about anything that inspired you about your co-panelists' presentations. One, I guess, is how has your process of working on storytelling and on creating narratives or revealing them change your understanding of the politics and processes and the definition of data? And I guess to inspire some of us, what aspect of your work do you consider to be the most revolutionary? Either or neither of those questions, but I invite you all to respond, and maybe we can go in the order in which people spoke, since your voices are the most rested, and we can go down the table, and then we'll definitely, we started late and we're running a little over, but we'll have some time for reactions and questions from the audience. So, Anisha.
Yeah. When we're talking about the use of data as art, so I'd just like to think about an experience when we were doing a participatory video in which we brought together a number of people who were sewerage workers who used to go down the drain at great risk to life to talk about their experiences through a video that they were making. This process, when they finished filming the video and they showed it at different places, for me, that was a very life-changing experience because while all of them, each of them consented to come for the process of creating a work of art like this, one of them ultimately ended up losing a job because someone saw the video and raised questions about how they could talk about issues as basic as safety, as basic as having safe equipment, things like that. And that made me think a lot about, as someone who does not belong to a community that is vulnerable and marginalized, as someone who comes from definitely a much different privileged background, and facilitating a discussion like this, sometimes we don't have control about the results of how the art or the work that we are doing, what it has, and what are the outcomes it has. And these can be both at the level of like the experience that I just shared, or it can also be at a very deeply personal level, because something like a digital storytelling is a very cathartic process. To go through it, you actually go through very personal experiences, and you think about how you want to present it. And it comes as, like for me, the personal question that I always feel is, while we may be ready for it, how ready is the person who is going through this process? And are we even taking that into consideration when we do something like this? So I just wanted to bring that up.
That's great, and thank you, because a question about the ethical challenges of doing this work was, I debated whether to make that one of my 2 questions, so thank you for addressing that. Yeah. Katie.
Just to like swing into the ethics, like, the theater troupes that are formed, like that we form across the city, are all folks that are living or have lived the experiences of the stories that they're telling. There is sort of as we all know, there's sort of like a standard storytelling model of the sort of like the protagonist and then the antagonist, and the protagonist needs to get something and the antagonist says no. And that is like the most basic sort of boiled down sort of like way a forum theater scene tends to play out, because we're trying to make it those terms really explicit. That also means that sometimes somebody is playing the role of the experience of oppression that they lived, and they are doing it over and over and over again. For some folks, that is a very cathartic experience. They get to sort of change the narrative in real time in front of people, and then challenge people who look like their oppressor. In other ways, it's asking them to sort of relive their trauma over and over again. And so that's a challenge, an ethical challenge frequently that we encounter, and that we also want to make sure that no one is doing anything that puts them at that sort of emotional risk or that risk of exposure, which is something that we think about a lot. I just want to like uplift that I think this work is a constant conversation. We're having an ethics conversation. I think I use the word ethical like 5 times a day, if not more, because we are consistently confronting that. What aspect of our work is the most revolutionary? I don't know, I guess the thing that I find much harder to quantify, and so it's about experiencing it in the room, which I think is also like the power of theater, of live performance, is when the time comes for everyone to just debate what is happening, or what changes they want to see, like the solution brainstorming part of our work. What happens is a lot of people become very vulnerable and very intimate, and they also show their level of expertise and their own lived experience coupled with where they're working. So like an example, a few months ago, we had a show specifically talking about what it means to be a queer youth in the foster system. And as the night wore on, as the conversations wore on, somebody revealed that they were actually somebody who worked in a group home, in a Catholic group home, and they were the only queer caseworker in that group home. And then someone else in the audience raised their hand and they were like, actually, I'm a lawyer that represents children in foster case situations. And the 2 of them wound up having a dialogue in front of the whole audience about ways to protect yourself as a youth and ways to sort of like be a better advocate as a foster parent. And I would say that those are the conversations that like I have no way of capturing them except to tell you with my own mouth that they happened, but they moved the needle, and now those 2 people are in contact with each other and they're trying to figure out how they can collaborate. And so I think that if I was to boil it down, the most revolutionary part of our work is that we're getting people in the room having these conversations who otherwise would maybe have not found each other. So I think that is the strength of that.
Thank you. Ethan.
I don't know if there's anything revolutionary about what we're doing, but I do think there's something transformative that can happen.
I think your mic might not be on, sorry.
There may be something transformative that happens along the way. And so I'm conscious with my students to think through these really critical ways of being in the world. I teach, what might be a conventional course on qualitative research methods, where they have to learn everything from how to conduct interviews to doing a human subject approved trial or a research project. But I also teach them along these very kind of well-known methods how to go out in communities and think ethically about their own reflexivity and what's happening when they themselves are in those places. How can they embody some of that experience and in collaboration with other participants, maybe it changes something about us. So that reflexivity is super crucial. It changes everything about the practices that we undertake. I think I'll kind of pause there because I think the work shows a great deal about what's happening in terms of its form and the kinds of questions it asks. But I'm always very, very concerned about myself doing this work as an outsider. I'm concerned about my students learning the tools to do this work with communities that have decades of marginalization. It doesn't mean that they can't do it, but they need to be equipped very carefully with the right sensibility. So.
Thanks.
Wow. You all have just answered everything, but I'm just gonna kind of like piggyback off of what you guys have said. What makes this work revolutionary for me is just taking a stand and inviting those in the space to elevate their voices, those that have been powerless and voiceless for so long, and being, in the South, because it's very challenging, being in the South, very conservative, and just taking a stand up and gathering people and standing in solidarity saying, look, you have oppressed us for so many years, and we're not going to continue to let you keep putting your foot on our necks. So that's what makes this work revolutionary for me, challenging, being a tenacious person that I am. And also, we're going to piggyback, and video storytelling, telling the story. I was just a part of the Forward.us, which is an organization based out of New York. They did a family study, and I was on their advisory board, and I was their second family. So that took a lot of courage for me to put my story out there about what I had been through as a mom of a formerly incarcerated person, what my family had been through, my friends, people that knew me, that were close to me, they knew, what I went through, but the world didn't know that. So I felt that there was a big healing process for me to come forward, to tell my story, to let other families know. You don't have to be ashamed about anything that has transpired in your family or with your kids, your husband, your sisters, your brothers, your uncles. We need to elevate our voices, tell our stories, because those that are closest to the problem are the solution solvers.
Wow. Well, in our few remaining minutes, I definitely want to open it up to the floor, and I think that's a beautiful note, one about a reminder about the courage and of taking a stand and of working on the margins of the dominant data narrative and trying to address gaps and reclaim space and control of physical spaces and decision making. So I think with those words in mind, I invite all of you to share your reflections or your questions. We'll take a few. There's one in the back over there, yeah.
Hello, I just wanted to ask Ms. Tate. Okay, going back to Arcadia instead of Alabama. I'm more familiar with the Florida judiciary than I am with the Alabama judiciary. So I believe, if memory serves me right, that's Hardy County. But the point is, it's cracker country, okay? So here, all your judges, they probably went to Florida or they went to FSU, most of the lawyers, okay? It's cracker country. It goes way back, right? Okay. So if you were back in Arcadia trying to help parolees with what you know now, what would you be doing?
What I would be doing is, when I got the job as a PO, I looked at getting to the root. You know, you had a lot of generational families that that were being supervised. You know, maybe the grandfather had been on probation, the uncle. I had a generational family at one point. So to shift that narrative and that trajectory, we have to get to the root of what is causing the issue here. You know, if you got somebody that are on, this generational family that I had, they were known for selling drugs. So that was a substance abuse issue or using drugs themselves. So why do we keep jailing individuals? So what I try to drive in any form of supervision is we have to arrive to the root, what is really transpiring in these individuals' lives. You know, we have to look, we get what's called demographic information. You have this information before you, you could tell whether or not a person is a high school graduate, college graduate, what has transpired. All these questions are being answered. So we need to address the root problem, because as long as we keep jailing individuals in this corrupt system that we have, jails, prisons, wherever we're sending them, they're not gonna get better. People are coming out of prison worse than they are. Prison is not rehabilitation. It's like a wild zoo in there. You know, a level of, like right now, the Department of Justice just released a 30-month report on the Alabama prison system, very atrocious. Just not even fit for humane conditions. So I'm a driver of the root, is to get to the root. I'm not gonna jail anybody. I'm not gonna suggest that those that are supervising individuals to keep jailing a person that has a substance abuse problem. Your job as a PO is to drive down the recidivism rate. You need to use every resource that you have to get this person well. Most people are coming out mentally ill. So I'm a driver and a proponent for getting to the root of what is transpiring with that individual.
Great. We'll take a few more from the field.
Hi. How do you deal with the realization that part of your target audience doesn't have empathy? Or do you deal with that? Or is the target more our neighbor than power?
Okay, we'll take a few more. I think that's for maybe, oh yeah, here and then here. Sorry, for anyone, yeah.
Thank you for this. Oh, should I
think-
go ahead? Thank you for this excellent panel. Oh, should I?
You just go and then
Okay, I'm sorry. I just wanted to ask a couple of questions. One is the struggle that I work in a human rights organization, and one of the where we use data for communities to advocate for their own development. And one of the things that we encounter is there's this struggle between how much do we conform to the status quo hierarchies of what is good data to make communities be legitimate or seen as legitimate actors, and how much of creatively brainstorming these things is actually a much better path forward. So that's one question I'd have, is do you see a struggle or do you see a conflict there, or how do you reconcile that? And the second one I have is how do you also decide when to end an engagement with communities? What does like a long-term involvement mean if you are not part of the affected community, and who has stewardship over that data in that campaign?
So thank you for what was a really powerful panel, because it's so effectively, by showing rather than telling, unsettled standard ideas of what should count as data, who should count as experts, what should count as a solution. And I think, as many of you have mentioned, these processes are transformative, especially at an individual level. But it's also true that so many of the systems of governance and power, whether it be systems of law, whether it be systems of government or philanthropic foundations that are looking for quantifiable indicators of impact want order. And these forms of evidence and data don't quite fit into their existing desires for measurability and comparability. So I'm curious, in your experiences, when you actually try and use these forms of evidence and types of data in dealing with a government, in dealing with a court, in dealing with a foundation, how convincing is it? Or do they just kind of push you out? And in some ways, I think it's exactly the same question that you had asked, the first question that you had asked.
Yeah, I actually think there's a lot of synergy between those questions. So, and I think they're really for everyone. And I know maybe in the interest of time, do you want to add? We'll take one more. Okay, we'll take one more, and then we'll do a little reflection on what those are, and you can each sort of respond to those that you feel speak to you, and any final remarks. But let me take an additional one.
Thank you very much. It was excellent. I wanted to add, because what Nikin said remind me about the Argentinian situation in relation to disappearances, enforced disappearances, and for instance, my grandparents who were political activists, they had to burn books too, so it is like very, very similar. There are many commonalities, but I don't know, after, I mean, when the democracy came back, in Argentina, we built a democratic conscience, a democratic memory, in which, for instance, responsibles for the genocide were imprisoned, the dictators were imprisoned. And I want to ask you about like the historical reparation in Guatemala specifically, how it is. That's it.
Okay, so just as a reminder, and it's a tall order to try to address some or all of those questions in your remarks, but I think that where I think there was a lot of synergy in the first three questions is really about how you, in working in the ways that you do, how you deal with whether to conform your data to status quo demands for order and measurability from institutions of power, or you present information in a creative way, and if that creative way doesn't conform to expectations of those in power, how convincing is it? What's your experience been? Or as the question is, if you gauge that there isn't a sense of empathy from the audience, the decision makers or others, how do you react to that, or are you not actually addressing that audience, those in power? Is the audience a different one? And then this final question about the situation in Guatemala, I think we won't ask all of you to answer that if you're not in the know about Guatemala, but maybe Nitin can. So should we go in the opposite order and maybe start with LaTonya and come back to Anusha?
Well, in Alabama, we've seen a shift in leadership there. We have our first African-American DA, and we have our first African-American sheriff. Very progressive, very open and listening, to things that are affecting the community. Our DA brother, was murdered. So he's very, very empathy when it comes to shifting the culture in the community and criminalizing individuals. I think I read something last night where we finally passed a bill in Alabama to stop criminalizing marijuana.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a plus. And having these conversations, and like I said, the leadership has shifted in our court system. We have a lot of African-American judges that are sitting on the bench that knows the things that are happening and transpiring in the community. One of my favorite judges is the two twins that were Judge Shantae Owens and Sheree Grant. They're two identical twins that were placed on the bench. Judge Shantae Owens runs drug court, and she runs it like a ministry. So we have what I'm driving in the community, and to those that are lawmakers and those that have been oppressed and suppressed for so long, and voices, is to, now that we have this power shift, so it's time to elevate your voice, tell your stories, bring families and friends. Storytelling, I'm learning, is so, so important. And I think once you continue to drive these stories, I think you'll start shifting the mindset of, the people that are in authority.
There's a lot of really good questions. I don't think I'll have answers for all of those, but I want to think about them with you. There's the issue of empathy, legitimacy, closure, that one of you mentioned, really difficult points. And I guess a couple of things I'll say is that just by opening up this data, so in the 2.5 years we were doing research on the Guatemala Después project, with my graduate student, I went to dozens of towns and cities all around Guatemala, meeting with artists, meeting with young activists, and getting them to participate in workshops with us in defining the kinds of expressions they want to make, in developing the collaborative models for the exhibitions that came about. Even just having them participate was giving them legitimacy. Bringing their work to the New School and having it exhibited here brought legitimacy to the work of these artists who would never spoken outside of their village or outside of their small social context. Americans know so little about what's happened in Guatemala and American government's culpability in Guatemala and most of Central America, as you know. It was RCIA that displaced the Guatemalans' free elected president in the 50s. And it was our actions that caused the military coup. So we were very clear about bringing this work to the US first and having American audiences engage with it, not just the works, but we had artists come present, we had filmmakers speak, it was a long program of action. The work in itself, there were artifacts in an exhibition, and you may or may not be able to get all of the poetic intensity and complexity of each of those pieces, but the longer conversations we had and the public programming around it, both here and in Guatemala, was super important. Your question about how does it fit with the order of what society expects and what institutions want, I think first we as institutions have to accept that artistic discourse can be a legitimate way to talk about human rights and justice issues. That's the first thing. And I don't think it speaks to everybody. I don't think it's speaking to all of the larger legal institutions. As you mentioned, Guatemala has not provided reparations to indigenous communities. The thousands who have lost their family members and their lives remain invisible, even in Guatemalan society, which is very divided about this. There have been many public human rights trials of dictators who have been allowed to go free in many cases, and some have been imprisoned. So that hasn't changed the real dynamic entirely. So some of these projects, and ours is not the only one, there are many other projects like this using theater, poetry, film, are I think most crucial to just get communities, audiences, local folks. I mean, I show a film like this for an hour, and there's a discussion of an hour and a half to 3 hours after the film with people who never talk about what their parents did to each other. So I think we have an accountability and responsibility first to work at the local, definitely at the local, and then allow the local awakening to then proceed to challenge institutions. So 3 years after I did this film, there were massive protests in Guatemala. Of course, the film had nothing to do with those, but the young people I'd worked with were very involved as civic actors in those protests, and were trying to change policies and corruption in Guatemala. So, we have limited agency, but they have agency, and maybe the right time that agency allows things to change. So I try to tell my students not to be too ambitious about what we can do to be transformative, but to really work in a local level to transform their own way of thinking and allow young people to have agency in these discourses.
Oh my gosh, there's so much here. I wish we could talk for like 3 more hours. So first, something that also has come up a lot in the last 2 days is a focus on like the process instead of the product. And I think that data, again, like everyone hears data, like the layman term of data, it assumes it's like, well, that's the final product of something. And so trying to see everything that you're doing as actually part of a process, and also like I think diminishing the positionality of your video in like 3-year-long protests, like I think actually like the months of work, you're part of a narrative, right? So I think that that's something else that is easy to do. We see ourselves and we see these actions as these individualized actions, which is a way, I also think is a white supremacist way of thinking about things, because the idea that like this one person did this one thing that made this one change is incredibly fucked up. So we should like erase that. We're all part of an intricate web of people, and we're all doing this work together, and it's very fantastic. So that doesn't answer any of your questions, but I had to say it. I work for a nonprofit, so I think about how we conform data to the status quo constantly, because we actually are mostly foundation and financed by foundations who want us to report on all of the change we've made on individuals and communities, and it's actually impossible, and frankly, we're mostly lying, and I won't lie, it's like what the percentage of change you made in individuals, like it's just wild. So, and then also the conformity of like, we got a grant that specifically said we needed to work with a specific identity in Queens, and then the folks that showed up to that community center, no one identified that way. So we had to be like, well, the scope of the project has changed. So I would argue in democratizing data, we should also fudge the data, and that's the way to also make change. The empathy and audience thing, so I feel very strongly, and I think most people in this room do too, that you really do need to see yourself when you are an organizer and an activist, you also need to see yourself as like a curator. You are curating spaces. And so when I'm reaching out to fill a room for a show, I actually am individually emailing and calling and meeting with people, explaining why they should really be in the room for the show. And that is for two reasons. One, I think that obviously the people in the audience should be reflective of the people who are on stage, because we're all generating these ideas as a community. Additionally, people doing work on that actual work, the organizers, the policymakers should be in the room so they're experiencing and hearing from their actual constituents what is actually happening in their lives. And part of that is also because theater, like most of the arts, has been sort of like compressed into this notion, this like white supremacist notion of who is a theater goer. And if I don't personally invite people and explain how our work works and explain how important theater is to make social change, I'm gonna have a room full of well-intended gray-haired white people who think that they're coming to see a theater show. And then they're gonna, I hate to say it, but that demographic is struggling with empathy. And so part of my direct addressing of that is to try to sort of like curate the audience so that we're not surrounding ourselves with the same people having the same conversation in the same way. And so when I'm confronted by somebody who inevitably is going to say, oh, well, that person just should have tried harder and their life would have been better, which is something that happens. Luckily, the joy of already being in a space where we forced everybody into good discomfort, I like to believe, we force you to be uncomfortable in a good way, is that we've got facilitators who will literally say, that's a problematic perspective. We're gonna challenge you on that. And maybe that person leaves feeling the same exact way and kind of wondered why they went to go see that weird theater show, but I hope it's a step that somebody blatantly, explicitly looked at them and said, that's not correct.
You can take it. Yeah, thank you. So I'll just take it from where Katie left off. So basically, especially in the context of not of theater but of a ground level panel, what you have is somewhere responding to Manjari's question, you have these government officials, you have people from the civil society who feel very important on occasions like this where they come for discussion. And on the other side, you have a panel of people who've never been asked for their opinion on many things. And these are the people and who face a lot of discrimination in day-to-day life about how they're going to get a job, how they're going to school, how they step out of home. And these are the people who are sitting on a panel. And it takes time for the people in the audience, like a government official, to realize that, okay, I'm here in this room, but I'm not sitting over there on the panel. I'm here to listen to someone else. So because that's, and especially in the Indian context, that's not how it happens. If you have a government official, usually they are the ones who have to be garlanded and welcomed and given a space to talk and given a lot of time to say what they want. Much of it will be very different from the reality of the people they are talking to. So, like a forum like this, what it does try to do is somewhere create a platform or create a space where these communities can engage in some kind of a direct talk. Rather than someone else talking about their stories, their experiences, it is they who are saying that, yes, we face this. And this somewhere also brings a response to your question regarding empathy, because faced with a situation like that, it is a given that they do not come with that empathy. They come believing that this is just some kind of a staged experience or staged discussion. But the hope is that somewhere through this discussion, through listening to what people have to say about what they are going through, maybe something might shift. And that's the hope that we work with. And very often, yes, it is quite disappointing to see the way, see some of the reactions come from, oh yeah, it was good to hear these, we know these, but what can we do about it? Our hands are tied. So, or the government doesn't have funds for these things. So, like even when talking about the ground level panel for the denotified tribes, so a good thing that came out of this ground level panel was the commission, the National Commission on Denotified Tribes. We did have a representative from there at the discussion who was willing to listen to what these people had to say. In fact, he first saw the digital stories and he actually agreed to come for this meeting. So probably somewhere these are things that make a slight difference. And in a way, it also questions the hierarchy that is there between using something like a digital story or a video or a documentary or theater to other forms of data, like graphs or infographics or anything else. And that, I think, is a good beginning. Thanks.
Well, great. With those words of a good beginning, I think we'll have a good end and closure. And I think keep thinking about this notion of constructive discomfort and our disruption of the status quo and shifting the lens of legitimacy that I think all of our speakers helped to disrupt our status quo of this conference and kind of put us in a place of constructive discomfort, turn the tables and make us think about these issues in a new way. So thank you all very much and for your patience. We know we ran over. There is lunch to be had and the conference will continue. Sukti has a message for us.
Just that we're going to start at 1:45, so lunch has been truncated, I'm sorry. Only 1:50, we can just come back and start the last panel. So please have your lunch, enjoy it, and then come back.
Thank you.